Hey there, welcome back to Politics. We're not in person this week, and Wheeler, you're joining from the oddest place, man. You have all these ropes behind you. It's either an amusement ride or something else more sadistic, man. What's happening?
Well, it's funny. It's actually a combination of amusement ride and sadism because I'm at work.
And they have you tied down, right?
They have me tied down. This podcast really is getting started on a strange foot here. No, I'm at work in the office, and I'm in this little room. And I mean, it's a tiny little room. I always say that it's like I'm sitting in here waiting for the detectives to come back in to continue my interrogation. You know, it's like that kind of room, which is fitting. And it's got this humongous picture hanging on the wall. It's a glossy rope, and it's just rope, a bunch of it, and I'm not sure what it's supposed to say, but whatever.
That's a heck of a background, man. So I hope, considering that location you're in, you have something to drink, man.
Yes, I did rope in a beer, and it was BYO beer. Bring your own beer here to work today, and it's called a Weissertime. It's a Hefeweizen. This is nice. From Hoppenstein Brewing Company. And I believe that is in, wait, I'm going to get that wrong. I don't know where they are. It's somewhere here in Texas.
Is it a Texas beer?
It is a Texas beer. Yeah.
I've never heard of it.
I need to figure out where that's from. Why don't you tell us what you're drinking while I try to cheat and find that?
Yeah, you need your old man glasses to look for that?
No, Grandpa? I'm just looking for it. Like, they've got a lot of writing on here. There it is. It's Grapevine, Texas.
Oh, Grapevine.
In North Texas, right in the middle of DFW. If you go straight up the middle there,
yeah,
right by the big airport, DFW.
I'm having a Heart of Texas. It's a red ale from Four Corners. I'm a big Four Corners fan. That's where we shot one of our promos over there. Yeah, they have Local Buzz is one of their popular beers.
Yeah,
I like
a good
that
place
one a lot too. Yeah, it's good. Have you already cracked yours open?
I have, and I've already had my first sip, and I really like this. This is a nice Hefeweizen here.
It's one of those days, huh? Drinking early.
It is. I should have brought a crazy straw to take this thing down while I sit here in front of all this rope.
Well, we're recording this at 8:30 in the morning, so it is encouraging that you were able to lighten up for the rest of the day. So let's get into the topic here, man, because this one is pretty interesting.
It is. All of our topics are interesting.
Yeah,
but yeah, this one, and you know, the thing about this one, Jason, is that this affects a lot of people. You could argue that it affects every person in Texas,
sure,
whether they know it or not. And we're talking about electricity and power generation, and specifically wind and solar.
Well, I think even more than that is it's private property rights, what you can do on your property.
It is. And this, that's the thing with this is, I think that a lot of people could think, well, wind and solar, let me tune that out. I know that the plan that I'm on right now to get my electricity is like, 3% renewable. I'm not going to worry about that. Well, the thing is that, like you said, this touches a lot of different things, including what you're allowed to do on your own land. Let's say you've got, 5,000 acres out in the middle of West Texas somewhere. This could very well affect what decisions you make about what you can do with your own land. And beyond that, even if your plan that you're on, your electric plan, is minuscule as far as using renewables, the fact of the matter is that renewables are powering a lot of the electricity that you use, even if you're on a plan that, doesn't commit to using a lot of it, just because there's a lot of it in the mix.
So if this goes away, I think you're saying if this bill passes, we're going to talk about in a moment, this could essentially raise everyone's rates and maybe even put electric rates, but maybe even put electricity in danger in the state. When you think that renewable,
that's what they're arguing. Yeah, that's what the wind and solar industry is arguing, that, hey, if you make things too onerous for us, it really will hurt this industry, and it will really hurt ratepayers here in Texas, because our electricity that we produce is cheaper than the other kinds that can be produced. And when we have that in the mix, it keeps everybody's electric bills lower than they would be. Now, people are going, wait, my electric bill is crazy compared to what it was, a year and a half ago. Wind and solar is saying, oh, it would have been a lot crazier if we hadn't been in this mix.
So, there's 6 or 7 thousand bills that get filed every legislative session. We're focusing on one bill. It's not the only bill, but this is the one we're focusing on today. It's a Senate bill. It's number 624. If you want to go look it up and actually read it, and it's moving through the Senate right now. Just got word the other day it passed committee by party line vote, and it got placed on the intent calendar in the state Senate. So by the time we release this podcast, it may have already passed the Senate and headed to the House. But Senate Bill 624 essentially requires every wind turbine, every solar panel farm that's on any land in West Texas or along the coast or anywhere else to be permitted by the state. It goes a step further, though, and requires essentially permission from people who live within 25 miles of it. They have to sign off on this thing, which is kind of odd. And that raises the question about private property rights.
And I don't know about you, but I might have trouble getting along with somebody who lives like right next door to me. I can't. Yeah,
I can't
believe it
imagine
or
that.
not. Believe it or not. I can't imagine having to get them on board with things that I want to do, as well as all of the people within 25 miles, like, hey, I'm going to do this in my backyard. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
So this is one of the big issues that's being talked about right now. But as you said, Jason, there is this whole slate of bills. This has really become a Republican priority to say, hey, we're going to stop, incentivizing to the degree that we have been wind and solar in this state, because it doesn't need it anymore. Wind and solar is doing just fine. It's its own industry. They've been able to put up all these projects. They're making money. They don't need the incentives anymore. What we need to be doing is building more generation capability with gas. We've got tons of natural gas here in Texas, and we need to build plants that run on natural gas so that we can provide enough electricity. That's what they're saying here.
And Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick made that one of his priorities. He passed a bill through the state Senate recently to incentivize more natural gas plants. Why natural gas? Why not coal? I mean, it's obvious coal is dirty. Natural gas, we have a lot of it right now in Texas. So the idea is they need to have more, power plants. They can just flip on with the flip of a switch if it's a really hot day or a really cold day.
And natural gas lets you do that versus
natural gas
wind or solar. Wind or solar, you
Yeah.
can't always depend on it being available right then.
And you know what I didn't realize? I haven't bought land out in West Texas like you have for a ranch, but there are a lot of ranchers and a lot of farmers who have these big spaces of land in our state, and they rely on the extra money that they get from putting a wind turbine up on part of their land.
Yeah.
And that's funding school districts in many Texas counties. That's funding roads in many Texas counties. And now the state is stepping in and saying, we want to have a say in where these go and if you can have these on your own property.
Yeah, and that might be keeping a lot of that land in the farmer's hands as well. I mean, if cotton doesn't do well in any given year or whatever it is that's being grown, they have some real troubles. This turbine that's sitting in the middle of their property is paying them year after year after year, and that's income that they can rely upon. So this is a layered thing here. There's so many different pieces to this. But the interesting thing is, to me anyway, is that you see a lot of these Republican proposals that would, according to the wind and solar industry, really weaken them. And it would affect all of these landowners in these very Republican strongholds, in these Republican strongholds, especially out in that West Texas area. I think Sweetwater and all around there. And so it's an interesting dynamic politically as well.
Yeah, and the person who wrote this one specific bill we've been talking about, Senate Bill 624, is a state senator named Lois Kolkhorst. She's a Republican from Brenham, which is in between Austin and Houston.
Where Bluebell is made.
Bluebell ice cream, man. I'm impressed. You know a couple of things about.
I know my ice cream trivia.
Have you ever been to Bluebell, by the way?
I have.
Yeah, it's nice. That's where I think I got this extra turkey neck that's underneath there. A lot of that country vanilla, my friend. But Senator Lois Kolkhorst is from there. She represents that part of the state, and she's proposing this for all of Texas. We reached out to her to ask her to come on and explain this bill. I'm really curious where it started. What was the genesis of this idea on why all of a sudden, after 25 years of or so of these wind turbines all over the state, why does the state want to come in now to start permitting them? That's kind of odd, but the senator's office did not respond to our request for an interview. So we did reach out to Jeff Clark. He is the president of the Advanced Power Alliance. Now, they represent renewables, specifically wind, solar, battery, stuff like that, but they support all types of energy, oil and gas, everything else as well. So we called him up to see what they think and to see what he thinks specifically about this one bill. Jeff, lay out Senate Bill 624. What exactly would this do?
Yeah, Senate Bill 624 is a really a bizarre piece of legislation. When you read it, if you read the preamble, what it describes is that the public of Texas, that the land in Texas needs to be protected from the threat of renewable energy. And it actually uses the police powers. So they want to direct the police powers of the state of Texas to protect consumers and the environment from renewable energy. And it is and remarkably, when it comes to regulating power generation, it leaves out every other type of power plant, every other type of energy production, and focuses solely on wind and solar projects.
It's mainly about, sorry to interrupt you there, Jeff, but it's mainly about permitting, you were saying.
It's permitting. It's fascinating. It is permitting on a going forward basis, but it's also permitting on a retrospective basis. So in addition to now deciding for every landowner in the state whether they can or cannot use their farm or their ranch or their family, hunting lease or hunting property, whatever they have, whether they can use that to build a wind or solar project, that choice will now be left up to the state. And interestingly, the bill has a lot of requirements in it, but the permit that the state would issue doesn't have any objective criteria where you as a landowner or you as a project developer would know, if I meet these requirements, then I can get a permit. The permit would be left up to bureaucrats in Austin who are not elected. And but it would apply retroactively. So every wind or solar project that's operating in the state today, and remember, we get about 26% of our electricity in Texas from wind and solar projects. All of those projects would now have to go back and seek a permit from this group.
And Jeff, we know about zoning and cities, and that makes sense. But when you get out in West Texas and that wide open spaces out there, why would the state care about what you do with your land?
I think the question is, why would the state care? But if they did care, why single out just renewable energy? And I look at this bill, people say, well, this is a solution in search of a problem. I don't even see it as that. This is so obviously, this is a missile in search of a target. And the target is renewable energy. The target is Texas consumers. The target is private property rights. It's crazy that it would. If it made sense, why would it apply to the only type of energy development that doesn't emit into the air and water, that doesn't, have major environmental impacts? And so it's so obviously an attack on renewable energy, and it's on top of a pile of other bills that have been filed this session to target renewable energy, and really, I think, to take advantage. We've had obviously a lot of excitement and challenges on our electric grid over the last couple of years, and it's taking advantage of that confusion and pushing an agenda that is designed to prop up other forms of energy and to push renewable energy behind.
Yeah, Jeff, we'll get into that whole stack of bills that your industry is up against right now. But let's stay with Senate Bill 624 for just a moment here. This
Absolutely.
one filed by Senator Kolkhorst. There's so many questions that spring to mind here. First off, you're saying it narrows it down. It zeroes right in on renewables and doesn't really address other forms of electricity generation. We keep hearing from oil and gas and from politicians supporting oil and gas in this state that they just want to level the playing field. And basically what you're saying is this totally undercuts that argument if you're specifically crafting bills that go after one particular kind of electricity generation.
It's a good, and we're supporters of oil and gas, to be clear. Advanced Power Alliance supports oil and gas. We envision a future where renewable energy partners with oil and gas to help them cut costs, to help decarbonize, to get more gas out to the world in a planet that needs our energy resource in a difficult European strategic environment and other issues. But so we're not anti-oil and gas, but that is the rhetoric that gets thrown about around all of these bills as well. We need to level the playing field. All of those arguments tend to ignore subsidies for all energy resources or permitting. Permitting is not a tool. I would argue regulation and permitting and government police powers couldn't be used as a tool to hold back one industry in order to encourage another, or vice versa. They should be used to identify what is it that we don't approve of. And we said this in our testimony, by the way. What is it that you don't approve of? And let's regulate for that. Is it emissions? Let's regulate emissions for everyone the same way. Is it sound? Is it impacts on land? Let's talk about what it is you want to regulate, and then what's fair to a private property holder. What they're doing here is tantamount to what we do in the old Soviet Union, where the government will now decide, well, we believe you ought to, keep farming this property. That's something that has come up. Well, we don't want to see so much land go from farming to solar. I don't know when it became the government's business whether I take 100 acres of my land and use it for a solar farm or take 100 acres of my land and use it for cotton. That should be left to private property owners, not the administration. And
yeah, it gets really specific here too. And first of all, we're hearing terms in this bill that this was again filed by a Republican here, but we're hearing things like environmental impact studies, industry regulations, property rights, where the state has police power. These aren't things that we have traditionally heard from Republicans here in Texas. And it gets really specific too, that you can't have, renewables built on your property within 1,000 feet of another property unless you get that property owner's permission. And then you've got to notify the property owners within 25 miles of one of these wind or solar developments, 25 miles, in addition to the county judges within 25 miles. And it just sounds like a lot of people would then have veto power over what you're doing on your land.
And the question is why? Why would anyone, I'm in Austin, Texas right now. If I'm building a solar project in Austin, that means I have to notify people what in Buda. Just imagine what a 25-mile line looks like. And then
what if you did though, Jeff? What if you wanted to put that on your property out in the middle of nowhere? Okay. And you did have to notify everybody within 25 miles. Would you have to jump through as many hoops if you wanted to drill a well there?
Today?
Yeah, absolutely not. But that provision is designed to stimulate objection to projects. This is a 25-mile notification is designed to say, hey, we're thinking about building a solar project in your community, and object. And but again, it's the bigger challenge. Of course, those kind of requirements, if that's a good idea, it ought to apply to everyone. Again, regulation, we always say technology agnostic regulation. Identify what it is. So you think a major investment of some kind or a major manufacturing project ought to notify everyone within 25 miles? Sure. I think it's a terrible idea, but keep it fair for everybody. But beyond that, you end up in a situation in this bill. There is no criteria that a solar developer, or even more importantly, I would say, and I obviously represent the companies that are building these projects, but I also know and work with landowners who come to us and say, hey, look, I have a family farm and we would love to take half of it and move it into wind or solar because we want the revenue when there's a drought, when commodity prices fall. We want to diversify. We've been here for 100 years. We've struggled to get by. And then they get the opportunity to get a solar project, and 2 or 3 neighbors who moved out typically within the last 5 or 6 years say, well, I don't want to look at a solar project. And so now this family that's been farming for 100 years loses the opportunity to get that economic prosperity that they've struggled to get. It really comes, and it's a slippery slope beyond, wind or solar projects. What happens when we say, well, your neighbors are tired of listening, to your cattle. This has become a suburban community. We know it used to be, and that's happening all over our state. This used to be a rural community, but now it's become a suburban community, or you're going to have to change what you do in agriculture, or frankly, for my friends in oil and gas. This kind of precedent, when the state's police powers are brought to bear against private landowners and safe activity. Again, if there's a dangerous, we've had wind in Texas for 30 years. There are no abandoned wind projects. There are no cases where a wind project has leaked and caused environmental damage. These are all regulated by state and federal law already, but they're creating a bureaucracy to target one industry. It should be frightening, not just to people who care about renewable energy. It should frighten everyone who cares about industry and private property.
Jeff, I'll say this, Wheeler does have a bunch of chickens in a coop in his backyard. We're trying to figure out how to address those. Maybe 624 is the one to
I wish I
address that.
did. Have you seen egg prices? Man, it would be great.
I'm sure there's a neighbor within 25 miles who would like to have those chickens removed.
Right. Hand raised right here. Hey, you said, and part of this bill is would be retroactive. So let's say I've had a turbine, a big windmill on my property out in Northwest Texas for the past 25 years. Right. What does this mean then if this passes to me as a landowner who's making some extra money on the side from this turbine?
It puts you as a landowner in jeopardy, and it puts that project in jeopardy. But here's the even more upsetting aspect of this is we have been, I joined this industry 11 years ago, and I was excited. I went to college in West Texas. My family was all from West Texas, and I got excited about wind power. When I went to communities that for the first time ever, they had a new school, they had new, tech building, tech and science building in several places. There are communities all over the state that have been transformed by the money that came in from these wind, typically, but now more and more wind and solar projects, and which typically become the number one, number two taxpayers in their communities. A lot of school districts have issued bonds because the power is sold on these projects on long-term contracts. So if I'm a school district, I'm looking at a $200 million wind farm. It's got a 25-year contract for power. I know that project's going to be there. I know there's going to be tax revenue, and I'm going to issue bonds, and I'm going to service those bonds with the revenue from these projects. This bill requires us to go back and get a permit for those projects. But this bill and then all of the other bills that are percolating in the legislature, what lawmakers don't understand is that when you pass a bill deliberately to kill these existing projects, companies are not going to run those at a loss. They're going to have to bankrupt those projects and sell them off or walk away from them. And it's the school districts and those rural communities that are counting on that revenue that are most at risk. So part of our work is, of course, advocating for the project developer, but part of our work is just advocating for the communities where we've already invested. We want to protect those investments, but we also want to protect the communities because we made a lot of commitments going in about the benefits we were going to bring. And the state's trying to change the rules with this and so many other things, change the rules in the middle of the game.
Let's talk about some of these other bills because we keep alluding to them. We've got Senate Bill 6, Senate Bill 7, Senate Bill 2014, Senate Bill 2015. Some of these would create incentives to develop, more generation that would clearly be gas. One of these would, sort of help the state to get in the business of building gas-fired power plants and use state money to do that. Some would, do away with incentives to build more renewables. How many bills are you watching right now in the Texas legislature? And how does that compare to years past? You guys used to be the darlings there under the Capitol Dome.
Well, and I think, the challenge, of course, is these are complex issues, and educating lawmakers, and I'm always reminded that being a legislator is a very difficult business because at 9 a.m. you may be working on child support enforcement, and at 11 you're working on the transportation code, and at noon you have a hearing on electricity issues, and so it's trying to be expert on all of these issues is challenging. And utility issues and power generation issues are among the most complex that we have. This is a session where we easily have 2 to 3 times as many bills to address. Last year, renewable energy saved consumers in the state last year, partially because natural gas prices were so high, but we saved consumers over $920 million a month during the last 12 months of the year. We hear every week, we hear from industry. The chemical industry is a perfect example. They need low carbon electricity because they have to decarbonize the product that they're exporting to the world. And we can sit in the Capitol in Austin and not buy into climate change or not buy into some of these climate regulations. But if you're selling into Asian markets as a chemical company, or if you're selling into the European market, those countries require lower emission. So if you're selling the pellets that get made into other products, say television sets, whatever, there's a need for our manufacturers to decarbonize. All of our projects are built with power purchase agreements to serve industry. That's what gets the projects built originally. So we know that Texas needs renewable energy. Consumers need renewable energy to keep the cost down. We believe a great system is a system that uses natural gas for reliability and renewables for low cost. And when you pair the two together, which we're infinitely blessed with, that you have a highly reliable system. Unfortunately, the blackouts that the state experienced during Uri, which consistently have been studied by everyone from FERC to the University of Texas, every major study identified a range of challenges, none of which were renewable energy was the problem.
But that's not what we heard initially. As soon as this happened, this is the winter storm from 2021, February. That wasn't what we heard initially. There was a bashing of wind and solar at the state official level.
Well, what's remarkable is that some of our state officials went out immediately and said it was we had a gas supply issue. We had, a failure to permit facilities, register facilities as critical. And therefore we had supply issues that were caused by facilities being shut off. We had challenges with wind turbines icing. Some folks went out and said, here is exactly what happened and told the story accurately. But as the news cycle progressed, you're absolutely right. It became within 2 days, it was time to appear on the national news networks and take this opportunity to bash renewable energy. Well, renewable energy is one of the things that keeps Texas manufacturing strong. It's one of the things that we use more electricity than almost any other state. And one of the ways we can afford our bills is by having 26% of our power coming from renewable energy. And by the way, one of the things we hear is, well, we have too much. States like Oklahoma, states like Kansas, states like Iowa, they all have more renewable. So we're number one because we're big, but on a per capita basis, on a household basis, we're using less renewable energy than a lot of our rivals. So it is a political opportunism to attack renewables and during this session. And but we're responding to it.
Jeff, let me take a quick side street on that. One of the issues, as you well know, with renewable energy is the capacity to store it. And battery storage is what everyone's been talking about. Well, during 2020 or 2021, Winter Storm Uri, if we had battery storage, we really could have relied more on the renewable energy. When is that going to come to fruition? When are big battery storage places going to be set up in West Texas or anywhere across the state?
Yeah, the storage is being, it's one of those, when I began in this business, we were the wind coalition. We were exclusively wind power. And I asked, well, why don't we diversify into solar? And several of the companies said, well, solar will never, that's not really going to work. 5 years later, we became the Advanced Power Alliance. Solar is now the cheapest by far, bar none. Solar is the cheapest form of electricity that you can generate. Batteries are the same way. For years we've heard, well, batteries are never going to happen. Batteries are happening now. Last year at the federal level, there were incentives passed to build the infrastructure we need in the United States to bring battery manufacturing here. There are battery plants. Kansas just got a massive battery plant. The automotive industry is driving a lot of the early investment, but we see companies. There's one that I'm keeping an eye on called Form Energy. They are making a 100-hour massive battery. They're using an iron oxide formulation. So they're using common materials to keep the cost down. They're very large, they're very heavy. They don't work for cell phones or cars, but they're perfect for the grid. And they're building their manufacturing facility West Virginia right now, we have.
When does that come to Texas though? When do the batteries physically show up here and are able to
batteries,
store the wind and solar?
Yeah, we have the largest battery storage project is in Texas right now. It's and there are, if you look at the queue, we have gigawatts of batteries lined up to get into this market. And so it is happening today. And it's something that frankly, we ought to be rolling out the carbon. I am optimistic. One of the issues we've talked about is the Chapter 313 program, the incentive program you mentioned earlier. I am optimistic that we will have batteries in that program. There was a push by several, just say the east side of the building to have batteries, but only if they were not charged by renewables, which is pretty illogical. But I'm optimistic they have seen the error of that language in the bill, and that we'll see batteries. But Texas is so well positioned to lead in oil, gas, LNG export, hydrogen, carbon capture, synthetic fuels. We did a study that's on our website about how much renewable energy do we need if we want to own 10% of the global market for green hydrogen. We're going to need a lot of renewable energy to make that happen. Carbon capture makes sense if you have cheap power available to power. It doesn't make sense to burn fossil fuels to power carbon capture. So if you have, or desal, where we can take salt water, we can take brackish water, we can clean that up for use in oil and gas production or as an agricultural source of agricultural water. There's so much we can do if we partner things together, and Texas is positioned better than almost anyone with the ability to export the energy that we can produce, and don't know whether it's hydrogen, whether it's natural gas. And we just envision that renewables are going to be a key part of that. We've got to have lawmakers who are visionary when they look at energy. Instead of making energy a social, energy shouldn't be a social issue. Energy should not be a political issue. It's not blue or red. The energy is a vital, it's vital. And so we're trying to guide people to a place where they recognize we can be supportive of every type of energy in this state, and we're going to benefit for the next 100 years because of it if we do it right now.
Jeff, let's take this back to the consumer if we can here, because I think some consumers sort of tune this stuff out and they think, well, I don't really have a dog in this fight. Explain if you can. You mentioned that wind and solar has saved Texas, electricity customers, almost $1 billion a month over the last year. Explain what that means when you say that, and because somebody will say, well, I'm not on renewable power with my electricity plan, and my electricity is costing me more and more. How is the industry saving Texans? Number one, and number two, compare how much cheaper it is to get power from wind or solar as opposed to, let's say, hooking up some gas to a power plant and creating electricity that way.
Yeah. The biggest cost, it's when you look at different types of power generation, a wind farm, and I'll use wind as an example. A wind farm is more expensive. The capital expenditure at the front end is more expensive, but there's no fuel needed to operate that plant. And so, of course, the challenge is it generates when the wind is blowing, and it doesn't generate when the wind is not blowing. But one of the things that we've done with wind in the state is we started around Sweetwater, and then we expanded into the Panhandle, and then we've expanded now to the Gulf Coast. And so we have different times of day where the wind blows at different intervals, and it begins to make a much more balanced profile of wind generation in the state. And there are seasonal variations. So there are times of year when wind is overachieving. I think yesterday we were 60 or 70% of the grid was coming from renewable energy. And that's not uncommon, but it averages out to about 26% over the life, or over the course of a year. 26% of our power, when you flip on a light switch at home, whether you're on a plan that's green energy or not, that power is coming from renewable energy. The variation comes when a lot of our power comes from natural gas. And so if natural gas prices are high, on the one hand, that's great for Texas because we generate a lot, we generate a lot of our wealth comes from selling natural gas and tax revenue that comes from natural gas. But it does create challenges for a consumer because your electricity price is going to be tied to that high natural gas price. And so it's leveraging the two together. Natural gas is so much cleaner than the alternatives like coal from Wyoming. And I say it all, I'd much rather use Texas natural gas and Texas renewables than go to Wyoming and buy energy. I mean,
But
Texas
hey, Jeff, just
do that, but
getting back to what Jason was asking, when people heard you earlier say that it saved, hundreds of millions of dollars, explain how people have saved on that. Cause I feel like my electric
Yeah.
bills are through the roof, man.
Well, and that is, of course, the challenge is sort of like when we get our property tax and they say, well, we saved you on your property tax. Well, I'm looking at my bill and it looked like it went up.
Hmm.
Well, those explanations, the challenge, natural gas prices in the course of the year, last year, natural gas prices were elevated and the year before. Again, good for the Texas economy, bad if you're burning it to make electricity. And so the reduction in the cost is based on what that power would have cost if we used, say, natural gas to generate that power.
Gotcha.
And which kind of gets to, to be honest, gets to the heart of some of what's happening here is there are folks who really don't care what happens to the consumer. They just want to see more natural gas get burned to make electricity. And so that's where the wisdom of lawmakers comes into play to say, okay, where do we strike the balance between natural gas, nuclear, renewables, and keeping a free market that keeps people investing and keeping costs down. But renewable energy, because once that plant is built, once it's built, there's no cost for fuel. It's just some basic operations and maintenance costs. It is able to produce power much cheaper than any other form of energy. The thing I always point people to, if they're interested, is what's called the levelized cost of energy study, which sounds
Jason, this is listen up.
Never heard of that one.
Yeah, this is a journal you probably know. Go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead.
Well,
What is this?
Lazard, Lazard, produces the levelized cost of energy study every year. It sounds much more boring than it is. It's actually pretty fascinating. And they look at everything from photovoltaics to, combined cycle turbines, nuclear, and what is the cheapest to build, what is the cheapest to operate. And in many cases, what you find is that new solar is cheaper to operate than some of these older, maintaining and fueling some of the old power plants. And that's got some folks scared. Again, that's where some of these bills come from.
Hey, you said earlier in the conversation here that you guys are looking at 2 to 3 times the amount of bills that you normally would have in a legislature. Why so much legislation going on right now?
Well, I think, part of it is after Winter Storm Uri, remember that happened in the middle, is when someday when I'm in a rocking chair in a retirement home somewhere and I look back on my career, I'll remember the joy of having a winter storm in the middle of a legislative session representing this industry. But that was obviously an incredible stressful time, not just for renewables, but for every company in the power business. We've had time since then. The legislature took action immediately on weatherization and some other issues to address that. Then we had the Public Utility Commission for a year and a half has been working on changes to our market to encourage more what they're calling dispatchable energy, which we don't necessarily have a problem with if there is indeed a need for more power. By dispatchable means power that you can flip a switch and it goes.
Right.
And so if, so obviously there are some power sources, solar, if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you need a solar panel to generate, that's not going to happen. But we want to make sure batteries are eligible to participate in these market design changes that they're making. But we've had a year and a half of the PUC's conversation and directed by the governor. And now the legislature is having their opportunity to look at those proposals from the PUC. And then a lot of folks just have ideas of their own. And then again, I think there's a lot of opportunism where folks have seen that we had the calamity last session and they're coming back this session. They've had a year and a half or 2 years to blame renewables. And they're coming back with a stack of bills to put more money in other people's pockets and take money out of renewables pockets.
Hey, Jeff, back to that argument that we'll hear from oil and gas a lot is that they want to level the playing field here. What is it that you get right now from the federal government or for the state government for renewables?
Yeah, there are the investment tax credit, and for solar, there's a production tax credit for wind energy. And, and it's one of those issues where we look at, I look at the incentives that are available to renewable power. Now, we've also put in, last year, the federal government put in incentives for hydrogen production. They put in a variety of incentives for carbon capture. So there are a lot of things out there that are supporting our friends in the oil and gas industry. And again, I'm not saying those are bad. It's just we spend a lot of time defending ourselves because the incentives available to renewable energy are very transparent. You build it, you generate power, you get a production tax credit, against your federal income tax. If you build a solar project, you get an investment tax credit that applies to your federal income tax. A lot of the incentives that we have, let's use nuclear as an example. And I'm a big nuclear fan. In fact, we have members and we're now expanding and looking at small modular reactors and how those can serve industry and cut emissions. So I'm not anti-nuclear at all, but to build a nuclear plant in the United States today, federal government provides loan guarantees, federal government provides liability protection, so there are lots of incentives that are in the tax code or they're built into statute that we don't think of in the same obvious and transparent way that we look at wind and solar incentives. And so, we as a country, we started subsidizing fossil fuels before we were a country. We set up geological surveys and we were building canals to move coal from the resource to the cities because we wanted to break our addiction on British coal, I think that abundant, affordable energy is so important. Having incentives to encourage energy production are good, and they're good for everybody. But
these bills even say these bills say you guys have grown to the point where you don't need them anymore.
That's what they say. So it's
do you need them?
I think Texas certainly needs it. What we're talking about here is a federal or state incentives. The question is, does Texas need an incentive to make Texas attractive for these investments? I would argue our industries benefit by having the renewable power available to them to cut their costs. I know we're up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Arlington truck plant, General Motors, that makes every Suburban, every Tahoe in the world that you see, came out of that truck plant. That plant runs on 100% wind power. Well, they're making vehicles that get about 12 to 15 miles to the gallon. This isn't a green, this isn't solely an environmental move. I'm sure that was part of it for General Motors. But what attracted them to renewable energy in Texas was a long-term, low-price, fixed contract through a power purchase agreement. And it allows them to plan for decades on how to invest in that truck plant. I know that renewable energy is good for Texas. The question is, what do we have to have in order to make Texas the most attractive place relative to other states? So Kansas today will offer you a 10-year property tax exemption on a wind project in order to encourage you to come to Kansas. That's what they offer. So, if you're sitting with an Excel spreadsheet and deciding where to invest billions of dollars in new energy projects, but it really comes down to whether you choose Texas or you choose somewhere else and which one's most attractive on the balance sheet.
So if Texas hurts your industry with what lawmakers are looking to do right now, the world doesn't just stop, is what you're saying here. These projects just go elsewhere and we miss the boat on those.
I'm headed to Baton Rouge tomorrow morning to talk with lawmakers about what they are trying to do with offshore wind, with offshore hydrogen, with onshore solar, to bring more chemical manufacturing to the state by making power available. And then on Monday, I'll be in Atlanta meeting with the hydrogen task force there. They're looking to manufacture hydrogen. They've got electric vehicle manufacturers. They just got a massive new solar panel factory. They're looking to produce hydrogen in that state for domestic use and even potentially to export hydrogen out of their own port. Texas has been an energy leader for a century. We are Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. We've provided this country with energy for a century. People are waking up where I now have the ability to produce electricity with a solar panel anywhere the sun shines, and I can produce hydrogen anywhere I have electricity and water. Every state in the country, every country in the world is now on the verge of becoming an energy producer. And Texas we have to rethink and reinvent ourselves if we want to continue to dominate in the next 100 years. I think we're better positioned than anybody else to do it. But the technology now makes anyone who wants to be an energy producer now has that ability.
So you got suitors lining up, is what it sounds like.
I think it's great for the consumer. It's great for the economy. It's great for United States technological leadership. We don't want to lose another industry. We want to win hydrogen. But Texas can win or Texas can lose. It's really up to Texas.
My last question, I want to go back to Senate Bill 624, the bill we started with at the very beginning of this by Senator Lois Kolkhorst from Brenham, Republican there. At issue, in case you skip through this, that this is the bill that would essentially require every renewable project, whether it's a turbine or a solar farm or anything, to be permitted and to essentially get permission from everyone who lives and works around it. I'm curious what's behind this. What do you think's going on here? What's
Yeah.
the genesis of this bill?
It's I don't want to trade in rumors, but I'll just entertain you with some of what we've heard. And I as soon as you mentioned the bill, I'm struck by the fact that I'm sitting in front of a screen. This device is more dangerous to me sitting here than a solar panel 50 feet away. I mean, the idea that we have communities all over the state where people are putting solar panels on their rooftops. It's the same solar panel. And the idea that we're now going to so heavily regulate, and the misinformation that we're hearing in these committee hearings about, toxic runoff and it's just, there's so much nonsense that has been spread. And there's a lot of coverage. There are groups out there that spend millions of dollars leading the public in the wrong direction on renewable energy. I think that this bill is about stopping renewable energy because there are a few, I think there are a few wealthy landowners in the state who don't want to see a wind farm nearby, or they don't want to see a solar farm nearby. And then I think there are also, and I will say it's not the oil and gas industry, because the oil and gas industry writ large recognizes the direction that technology is going. And some of them, we have oil and gas members of our association. Some of them are embracing and developing business strategies around this. But there are a few folks out there who are funding these types of campaigns to stop competition.
Jeff, I'm almost done as well. I just wanted to ask you off the top of your head, how many jobs does your industry support here in Texas, and the economic impact as well, real quickly?
Yeah, there are over 40,000 people currently working in advanced energy. Obviously, on the solar side, we get a lot of construction jobs, but more and more. Firm in Dallas that manufactures wind towers just got a $750 million order for wind towers. So we're building, and this was what we promised a decade ago, build the industry, and the manufacturing ecosystem will grow up around that. So,
and what would you say your economic impact is here? How big is the industry in Texas?
The industry in Texas, we have $93 billion invested in the state. We're paying about $11.3 billion on the existing projects are being paid out to the landowners who host the projects. And I lied to you. It's 42,000 Texas, 42,000. So our numbers are up a bit. And then there's over 50 of the Fortune 500 companies in Texas are getting their power from renewables. So the other thing I would point to in terms of economic impact, we are the major economic driver. Other than agriculture, we're the major economic driver in rural Texas, because think about all that land that's exempt from taxation because of agriculture. It leaves the tax burden on the relatively small number of homeowners and businesses. And
that's exactly where I was going to take you next there, Jeff.
Sure.
Business Insider actually has a map of the U.S. and you look at Texas and the hotspots for jobs in this. You don't see any of the big urban areas represented. You see that, big swath of rural West Texas out there. Our friends over at the Sweetwater Economic Development Corporation, they're in Nolan County, said that if they were to be ranked along with other countries in the world, just that county would be the 26th largest wind producing country in the world. So, it is interesting the politics of this. You have Republicans pushing these bills, but that's Republican country out there where these landowners are getting paid and where these jobs are paying people.
I don't want to run out of time with you, but I'll give you another thought. When you look at our elections and who elects our leaders, the deciding factor tends to be our rural communities. You just look at how they vote. And, my people are Midland and Abilene. I know how people vote out there. Where we're investing in Republican communities that need investment. 2/3 of our projects go into counties that are considered low wealth per pupil counties. So we're going to places that need capital investment to drive up the tax base for their students. And, and I think it's important. on a variety of issues, but I think it's important for lawmakers to stand with rural Texas. Rural Texas doesn't have the influence that it had when I moved from Abilene to Austin 30 years ago. It doesn't have the influence it had back then, but rural Texas is vitally important to the health of the state overall. And we have to keep investment going there in the, in all forms, but especially these energy investments that pay out over the long term are really key for so many places.
Jeff, I'm going to ask one last question just so I can watch Whiteley's head explode on this Zoom call. So the waiting game here, I mean, we're getting, the clock is ticking on the Texas legislature, just like it is on this podcast. I'm just curious, how much of this is a battle of attrition and just hoping that these bills will fall by the wayside when you're representing this industry?
Well, it is a challenge, especially when there's so many bad bills this year. And I thank you both for letting me spend a little time with you. If people will pick up the phone and call their lawmakers and say, "Hey, focus on things that matter, quit messing with renewable energy," that would help a lot. They need to hear from the public, but it is a waiting game. It's nothing is safe until May 31st, and it creates a lot of gray hair and anxiety, but we'll keep fighting, and I appreciate the chance to share our story with you.
Yeah, 5 weeks left in the legislature, and SB 624, the one we talked about, plus all the others Jason ran down the list on, are certainly some we'll be watching to see whether they can make it across the finish line. Jeff, thanks so much for the insight. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, Jeff Clark there with the Advanced Power Alliance, and sort of laying out what his industry is facing right now. And Jason, it's a lot like, basically they're just, playing goalie at this point, trying to keep as many pucks out of the net as possible. In this legislative session, and seeing if maybe they can wait out, maybe a battle of attrition here, if they can wait out some of these bills and have them sort of die on the vine. We'll see, but there is a concerted effort to push some of these bills through and make some changes as to how this state views wind and solar and the subsidies that go to them. Governor Abbott has said, hey, they get federal,
Right.
They're already getting federal money. Do they necessarily need something here at the state level as well? Any further encouragement?
Did you hear what Jeff said? This session, it wraps up in about 5 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm.
This session has 2 to 3 times more bills than normal targeting renewable energy. To think of how serious he's taking this, and apparently some landowners who are part of his organization, the line about the Soviet Union, that if this passes, this will turn Texas into the Soviet Union, where you don't get to decide what happens to your property. The state gets to decide what happens to your property. I thought that was interesting. And it's always worth reiterating, 26%, about a quarter of all the electricity we use in Texas is generated by wind and solar. Wind and solar has a lot of work they need to do. They need to figure out, battery technology has to improve. They have to figure out how to actually store some of that for the cloudy days or for the days it's not windy. That is coming. And so are the attacks, it seems, on renewable energy, because so many people, so many jobs, so much investment is still tied up in oil and gas in our state.
Well, I thought it was stunning when you speak about industry too, what he was saying about how this helps a lot of big industry here in Texas, which we've got a ton of. This helps them to sort of quote unquote clean their product. Like, if they're energy intensive and they're trying to sell to markets that have specific benchmarks saying, hey, you got to be, cleaner than this. If they're using clean energy, that helps them to sort of clean up all of the energy that they're using or all the carbon that they may be producing. And so this affects big business here in Texas as well. As we said at the outset, multi-layered. This is multi-layered. We should mention that we reached out to the Texas Oil and Gas Association to see if they wanted to talk about this as well. Todd Staples, the former land commissioner here in Texas, declined on this occasion. He heads up that organization now, said it's just too busy of a time right now to talk. Or maybe it is that they just, really didn't want to necessarily get down into this one. It is interesting that they did decline to talk about this and not necessarily, perhaps take any kind of a position on this. Also interesting that the Advanced Power Alliance says, hey, we're not anti-gas or anti-oil. We all need to work. We need all of these sources here in Texas. as you know, February of 2021 showed us, we need as many ways of producing electricity and as much of it as we can get here in Texas. That's basically what they're saying.
One of my biggest takeaways that you know, everything's political these days. There's always cultural wars going on about every single thing in the world. But one of the biggest takeaways from Jeff Clark, as you just mentioned, that he does support oil and gas along with renewables, and anyone you talk to, even Republicans who support this, will say privately, yes, we need all types of energy in our state, and we lead right now in all types. But here's my takeaway: energy should not be red or blue. At the end of the day, we all need it. It's like the air we breathe. We've got to have electricity to charge our phones, to keep the lights on at our house, to keep the AC and the heat running as well. And it's crazy it has become political, but it has, obviously, because money is involved.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, maybe it makes it less political if everybody has to turn off their air conditioner in the summer for a couple of days and feel what life is like without that. Because, you know, you got it. This state is growing. A lot of people are moving here, and we keep seeing these warnings with the grid every year over and over and over again, like, hey, we need you to cut back because we don't think that we can produce enough and this and that. Yeah, it is clear that you need to scrounge and get it from every source you possibly can right now. But, you know, at least, you know, wind and solar say it looks right now like the state is trying to pick winners and create losers. And they say that now is just not the time for that. And that, you know, Texans need to be involved in this. I thought it was interesting that he closed on that note, basically saying, hey, you know, we're being vigilant in the legislature. We're doing as much as we can to swat these things down. But it would help if we had people just picking up a phone and calling their senator or calling their representative at the state level and saying, hey, you know, leave this alone. Let's let it be.
Senate Bill 624 is the main one Jeff was talking about. He did acknowledge, as you said in there, Jason, there are many others they're trying to fend off and keep out of the goal as well. And we have 5 weeks left in the legislature. It sounds like Senate Bill 624 is going to be headed to the House for consideration there. And if it passes there, obviously it goes to the governor's desk for a signature or for a veto. I can't imagine Governor Abbott might veto this. But we shall see what a final form of this looks like if it makes it that far before legislators adjourn on May 29th.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to us once again. And, you know, share this podcast with someone you know, because it's great to get people, you know, up to speed on all the different issues that are going on here in Texas. And leave us a comment, subscribe here to the podcast, and let us know what you think about, you know, the subjects, the guests, the things that Whiteley has said, beer choices, whatever you like.
The things Whiteley has said. What are you talking about?
Did I say that?
You're talking about you can't get along with your neighbors within 25 miles, much less like right next door. You're tied up down there in that room, man.
Yeah, now I'm locked in an interrogation room. Things are not going well for me, man, but at least I have my Hefeweizen here.
At least you have a beer, my friend. Cheers to you.
Cheers.